From UFOs to psychic powers and government conspiracies, history is riddled with unexplained events. You can turn back now or learn the stuff they don't want you to know.
Democracy is, I think most people can agree, a fragile concept. For most of us listening in the audience today, the events of January 6th in Washington, D.C. show just how fragile this system can be. And across the world, you can sadly find numerous examples of coups and dictators and so on. And democracy, in a way, is like a living organism. It must be nurtured. It must be protected. In today's episode, we're exploring another story of democracy in peril, an often overlooked example. It's the story of an alleged conspiracy. It's a story of big business. It's the story, perhaps most singularly, about a man named Smedley Butler, a complex guy who, in his time, was called everything from a war hero to an activist and a traitor and a crackpot. This is the story of the business plot, and we are not exploring it alone. We are immensely fortunate to be joined today with Jonathan Katz, a multi-award-winning journalist and, most recently, the author of Gangsters of Capitalism, Smedley Butler, the Marines, and the Making and Breaking of America's Empire. Jonathan, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Hey, good to be here.
Man, I got to tell you, Jonathan, we talked about this story, just Smedley Butler, in 2010 in a video we made for YouTube. And, we delved into it. I recall, Ben, you and I just being kind of, I was personally flabbergasted to know that this was something that had occurred.
Jonathan, you and I have talked in the past for some other projects as you were working on this book, which is, for my money, the most comprehensive work on Smedley Butler. You came to this as a seasoned investigative journalist, and I think, in a way, this story starts for you in Haiti, right? When you were on the ground in Haiti during the deadliest earthquake ever recorded in the Western Hemisphere to this point. So could you tell us about how that connected you to Smedley Butler?
Yeah, so, the people who know about Smedley Butler usually know about him through one of two routes. Either they were Marines and learned about him in boot camp, or they know about him because of either the business plot or his sort of anti-war, anti-imperialist activism in the 1930s, especially his book War is a Racket. I am part of a minority of people who know about him principally because of his work overseas, especially, as you note, in Haiti. So I was the Associated Press correspondent in Haiti from 2007 until 2011, which means that I was there on almost exactly, actually, 12 years ago on January 12th, 2010, when I was very fortunate to survive the 7.0 earthquake that killed 100,000 to 316,000 people. And it was when I had encountered Smedley's name before that in the context of an event that most Americans don't know about, but Haitians very much do, which was the U.S. occupation of Haiti that lasted for 19 years, from 1915 to 1934. It was the longest continuous U.S. occupation, military occupation, until that record was broken in Afghanistan just before we withdrew. And after the earthquake, I sat down to write my first book about the earthquake, and I was looking for information about, I was trying to basically set the scene of like, how did Haiti become so fragile? How did this country become so poor? And how did things get to a place where, a relatively moderate earthquake, it was big, I can tell you, but it was a relatively moderate earthquake as earthquakes go, killed more people than any other earthquake ever recorded in North or South America. And that brought me back to the U.S. occupation of Haiti, which brought me to Smedley Butler. And so I was looking for information on Butler, to sort of liven up this, in case I was going to use any of his information in the book, because he's a fascinating, I could just tell that he was like a colorful guy. He's a Quaker from Philadelphia. So the first thing that stuck out to me was some of his letters have been collected in an edited volume, and he uses his Quaker these and thys. So he's like, he's like writing his parents, and he's like, like thy affectionate son, is in Haiti doing horrible things. And so then I was like, okay, so who, what did this guy look like? Like, just plug him into Google, see like if there's more information out there. And what comes up is the business plot and war as a racket. And my first instinct was like, well, this can't be the same guy, because in Haiti, Butler was known as the devil. Literally, they called him that. Like he was, considered, one of the worst of the Marines who were the aggressors in that occupation, at least as far as the Haitians were concerned. And then, to have that guy turn around and become a anti-war activist, somebody who foils a fascist plot, that didn't make a whole lot of sense to me. But of course, it was the same guy, and that set me off on the path to try to figure out, who was Smedley Butler.
Wow. My understanding of the part of the Marines' deployment, the use when they were in Haiti, was to protect property and interest, like American interests. Could you just talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So without getting too into the weeds here, but the occupation started with an invasion in 1915. It actually started first in December of 1914 with a bank heist. The Marines, Butler was not one of these Marines, although he would have been if he had been ordered there. Some Marines came ashore and literally robbed the Central Bank of Haiti. They took half the gold and brought it to New York, to a vault on Wall Street, where, as far as we could tell, it never left. It certainly never went back to Haiti. The reason for that was, reason, I'm kind of putting reason in air quotes here, but the reason for that was that Haiti traces its origins to the only successful slave revolution in modern history. The enslaved people of the French colony of Saint-Domingue rose up, overthrew slavery and their French imperial masters. And as a reward for this, about 20 years later, the French then imposed a crippling indemnity on Haiti, where they basically said, okay, we won't invade you again, and we won't, and we'll give you diplomatic recognition if you pay us an enormous fine, which it took the rest of the 19th century for Haiti to do. And the Haitians did that, but in order to do that, in part, they had to take out loans from banks elsewhere. And some of those banks were in the United States, and the biggest of those banks in the United States was the National City Bank of New York, nowadays known just as Citibank. And Citibank was worried that they weren't going to get, the full payment of their debt, and so they went to the Wilson administration. Woodrow Wilson was president at the time, and said, let's rob the bank. That made things even worse in Haiti. A president was assassinated. The last time a president of Haiti was assassinated until last summer in 2021. And then that was used as the pretext for a full invasion. So it was an invasion basically requested by Citibank and done for the purposes of making sure that their ledgers were right. And then other American capitalists, other, exporters, investors, real estate people, like all these other Americans came down to take advantage of that. And Smedley Butler was ultimately the point man on the ground. What makes him a fascinating character, and one of the reasons why, I just, spent the last, 7 years really writing a book about him, is because he was everywhere. He was in every, U.S. invasion and occupation, basically from the war in Cuba against Spain in 1898 until, the 1930s, the eve of the Second World War. But Haiti, for one of the things that I had in common with Smedley Butler, is that both of us spent a significant amount of time and to a certain extent, the height of at least, a part of our careers, for better or for worse in both of our cases, in in an amazing country, but in Haiti.
This is something that the reason I think this is a great entry point is because this is like you said, you're in a minority of minorities by the way you connected with the story of Smedley Butler. But this story is also still so extraordinarily obscure to the average member of the American public. They, like you said, Marines may learn of Butler in boot camp, where he is considered a war hero because he was deployed on a global scale. But when we're talking about this story, this will interest our audience today. So we started with a bank heist. Citibank conspired with Uncle Sam to rob a bank in Haiti. That's not the conspiracy. That's not what this episode is about. That's just how
totally separate. Yes.
Yeah, like a side conspiracy.
Exactly.
Yes, that's a side conspiracy. Yes. The conspiracy that we're talking about, that we're going to explore in depth today, is something that today is known as the business plot. And I love that you've already pointed out Butler, over the course of his life, had this transformation from a diehard Marine, a true believer, as maybe Stan Lee would have put it, and he became a very prominent, very outspoken, barnstorming activist. Could you, and I know this is tough because you wrote an entire book on this, but could you, in a brief kind of headline snippet, could you tell everyone what the business plot was, at least from Smedley's perspective?
Yeah. So essentially, the headline of the business plot is that bankers, specifically, brokers, specifically one prominent Wall Street stock brokerage, approached Butler with a plan in which Butler would lead a army of about 500,000 World War I veterans into Washington. They would basically go up Pennsylvania Avenue, maybe surround the White House and intimidate Franklin Delano Roosevelt into either resigning or handing the bulk of his power over to a cabinet secretary who the plotters would name. And the reason,
eerie rings of the present.
Very much
what
so.
We saw at
the
insurgency.
Yes, exactly. Just the other way down Pennsylvania Avenue, basically. The numbers go up instead. And the reason that they were doing that was because they were rich and they hated the New Deal. So it's the Great Depression. Millions of Americans are suffering. And Franklin Roosevelt has promised and is starting to implement programs to use the wealth of the federal government, the power of the federal government, to help Americans in lots of different ways by, ultimately, giving them Social Security, old age insurance, helping with infrastructure, the Tennessee Valley Authority, so like the electrification of the rural South, deposit insurance, jobs through the Civilian Conservation Corps. Not all those things were in place at this moment, but this is what he was rolling out.
So commie stuff, basically.
Exactly. And from the perspective of, the people who Butler alleged were, and really what Butler's contact with this stock brokerage alleged were behind this plot, they considered it one of the DuPont brothers of DuPont, who was sort of the most powerful and richest person associated allegedly with this plot. He did say, and this is recorded, that the New Deal was essentially the socialist doctrine by another name. I mean, the thing is that in 1933, 1934, 1934 is when Butler blows the whistle on this in front of a House committee in Congress. A lot of people thought that liberal democracy was over. The Great Depression was a tremendous shock to the capitalist worldview. It was a total failure of capitalism, and it looked like it looked to a lot of people like, having people sort of, have like the American style constitutional government, elect their leaders, elect a president like Franklin Roosevelt, that was maybe on its last gasp, and that the only ways forward would be either fascism or communism, in the sense that Stalin was implementing communism in the Soviet Union at that time. And sorry, go ahead.
Oh, why did these plotters think that he would be down for this, given his track record as like a patriot?
Whoever we know was behind it, and I can talk about the people that we know and the people who we can theorize. They very badly miscalculated, obviously, in getting Butler. But you could see what they were thinking. So as we noted at the top here, Butler had a long track record of participating in coups and overthrowing democratic governments all over the world. He had helped overthrow governments in Nicaragua. He had helped overthrow governments in Honduras. He had helped prevent a democratic government from coming to power in the Philippines when he was participating in the colonization of the Philippines. In Haiti, where he also helped overthrow the president, through the invasion of 1915. In 1917, he actually led a kind of a business plot, January 6th like thing in Haiti, in Haiti's National Assembly, in the parliament. Essentially, Haiti's constitution, going back to their days of self-liberation, prohibited foreigners from owning land in Haiti without getting, some kind of special permission, or generally, by marrying into a Haitian family. And that wasn't going to work for the Americans, who wanted to just, buy a bunch of stuff in Haiti and make a bunch of money. So the Wilson administration, the State Department, decided to write a new constitution. So there was a puppet president in Haiti at that point, but the Haitian parliament was still essentially independent. And so Butler led an armed column of Marines and members of the Gendarmerie d'Haïti, which was the Haitian client army, basically a preview of the Afghan National Army, or like our client militaries in Iraq and other places, which people might be more familiar with today. And he said, "You're done." And he shut down the parliament, went through the archives, destroyed all the records of the parliament's last votes in which they were planning to reject the American written constitution. And the parliament didn't meet again for 12 years. So that was done, on behalf of banks. So it was not a ridiculous thought for a banker to be like, this guy is good at doing these things.